The final quarter of this fiscal year and give you all just a budget update. We know that the $18 million hole scare has been running rampant through the rumor mill, and it was true, but as you heard our city manager say, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that budget is balanced and that all the bodies that are at the city now are still here, and that it just means we have to hunker down for one more year. I guess is kind of how that happens, because we all get the feeling that things are getting a little better, it's just that we're not in the woods yet. So I wanted to start off my presentation thanking Gayla, Zach, Cindy, my team, we're small but mighty, and for all of the work that they have done and will continue to do as we go through this process. So thank you all very much, and Gayla, you coming back has been more of a blessing than we could have possibly hoped for. So thank you for spending your retirement with us once you finally got out of here. We sucked you right back in. I also wanted to thank my fellow department heads and all the analysts in the room that have been reacting to some of the requests that have been coming out of the Office of Management and Budget. Most recently, last week, I think, I threw the zinger out there, hey, if I had to further reduce your budget, services and supplies by X amount, where would you take it from? And I recognize that that's like squeezing blood from a turnip at this point, but everybody was gracious enough to react, to take a really good look, to provide great insight in a timely manner. So thank you all so much for that. I know that it's not a fun exercise and I don't like to have to ask, but we have to kind of gear up and prepare for, as we go into this council policy making session on the budget, we kind of have to be prepared in advance for what we can do to sort of get this thing to balance. So I just want to reach out and thank everybody for your efforts. Everybody's been very gracious, and I know there's been a lot of eye rolling because I can sense that, but it's warranted, I feel. So I also wanted to use this opportunity to remind everybody we are coming into the last quarter of the current fiscal year, which is the get your invoices paid. Make sure you receive the invoices for things that you've got outstanding right now. What we don't want to have happen is have things come in post-fiscal year that won't get booked to the current fiscal year that we're in. So that's something that we're working on with finance annually to try to make sure that, we've got folks that we hear, oh, well, we don't get an invoice from them usually for 30, 60 days after we receive, said product. Well, you guys need to pick up the phone or do whatever you can to get those invoices in so that we can get them booked and paid, because we don't want any surprises. Next year's pretty darn tight. So with that, we'll get a kind of a glimpse into next year's budget. We'll start with a general overview of what the budget looks like from an expenditure. It's kind of hard to see, I apologize. From a revenue, because you guys all sit in the back. These tables are all free. From a revenue and expenditure standpoint, I wanted to give you a snapshot again of where the money comes and goes. And so you can see up on the left-hand side, you've got your revenue pie chart. Ad valorem, which is your property tax, is the big blue section. C-tax, which is liquor tax, cigarette tax, sort of a sales taxy type mix. That's another big section of our revenues. Those things are starting to shape up. That's the good news. We've got the other pieces that are franchise fees, the other big chunks. So if you think of it in three big chunks, the first two being the blue and the green, the others is kind of lumping together licenses and permits and franchise fees. So they're about $42 million each respectively. So those are a pretty good chunk of where the revenues come into our budget. And of course the planning begins around how those expenditures go out. And we move over to the expenditures chart, which the big chunks, the blue and the green, are salaries and benefits. And we all got the total compensation statement in our last paycheck, or with our last paycheck, that shows that the majority of our expenses are around us, the people, the folks that keep this city moving and running. And it's very, very typical in municipalities all around the country that those percentages range anywhere between 70% and 90% is the most standard of the. So we're kind of in the middle or upper end at 85, 82% of our expenses are people. So that's a tough one, so that doesn't leave me a whole lot of room to try to wiggle within the budget to make further reductions, as you can see by this pie chart. So I just wanted to drive that message home as we cruise into the presentation. So this fiscal year, how are we looking? We've got revenues that we're projecting through June 30th that are very closely aligned. This is kind of a shocker, is how budgeting works, right? Very closely aligned with our expenditures. We're looking right now to have about a $236,000 shortfall, which is really not Andrew calls it budget dust, which I think is kind of a great term. He had a much bigger budget at the state that he dealt with, so his dust was, you know, a little bit larger. But our 236,000 we think is we can overcome with some savings in salaries. We've got some services and supplies savings that we're expecting to see at the end of the year. So don't go crazy with your bad selves, buying up as much as you can in your budgets. You all know this at the end of the fiscal year, because we are counting on some of that savings to balance this current fiscal year's budget. The bad news is that this year we're not going to carry forward any stabilization, which we did last year. We ended the year for the first time in, I think, 3 years with about $2 million in stabilization, which is our rainy day fund. We're draining that down this year. There's a number of reasons that is the case, but with that being said, we're hoping, and we will replenish that in next fiscal year's budget. That's, like I said, a rainy day fund that protects us from, acts of God, or certain wildfire incidents, or whatever it is that causes us to go over budget, things that we hadn't planned on. It's nice to have a little safety net. So we're going to have to draw that down this year, which means we don't have much to carry forward. And then, of course, our ending fund balance, we have to budget at the beginning of the year's beginning fund balance. That's something you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next couple of years. That is something which would call our reserves that we need to really focus hard on as a top priority, getting that built up. We're currently sitting at the minimum required 4%. The goal, the absolute first goal fiscally for us, is to get to the maximum allowable 8.3% before that number becomes open for active bargaining. We'd obviously like it to be a lot more, but right now our goal, it's kind of eating the elephant a bite at a time, is to get to that 8%, which is about $16 million. So we'll get there. It's just that we have to kind of get some things in alignment first. I guess you probably can see that, hopefully. I don't know if you guys in the back can see it really well, but this is a snapshot of the revenues. This is just the current fiscal year and kind of how that revenue number, that $166 million number, $166 million number breaks out. So you can see that we've got the 4% beginning fund balance. It's down a little bit. We've got the property taxes, which we adjust those as they come in. So what you're seeing is the amended budget. So of course we adopt a budget at the beginning of the fiscal year, and then as we go through with these augmentations presented to council, we're constantly realigning that budget with revenues or expenditures, or moving money around. That's what we call the amended budget. We've got C-tax, which you've been hearing about. Sales tax has been improving. That's one of those good signs for economic recovery. And you've been hearing about that in the news, and we feel good about where that's going. It's just that, again, we're not out of the woods yet. So with that, we're seeing slight increases in those revenue sources. Charges for service are down. Those are like parking meters. There's a shocker for all of us. Those things are falling in less than expected. Franchise fees is kind of an anomaly. I will take full responsibility. We sort of over budgeted that at the beginning of last fiscal year, so we're missing the mark on that one pretty good, which is unfortunate. But we've got the intergovernmental, which is our transfers and so forth. We've got fines and forfeitures. Those are the parking tickets, and then the parking fines and traffic tickets. Those are down quite a bit. That's a direct correlation to loss of personnel in PD, I believe, is kind of the best way to explain that. And of course, parking tickets, again, blank scripts this every chance we get. And then we've got the other miscellaneous, which includes our special assessment districts and some other miscellaneous revenues. So looking at about $1.1 million shortfall on the revenues for this fiscal year. And then we jump into the other side of the house, which are our expenditures. And you'll see that we're over on our salaries and wages. A lot of that has to do with severance pay, so and some of the unexpected things that we haven't been budgeting for in the last few years. I mean, we can project out what folks make as far as salaries and benefits, but when when somebody decides to cash out some vacation or do what, we don't typically have that budgeted. We're moving towards that because it is a reality of an expense that we do incur. But in the last few years, when we've had to find places to cut, those are the areas that we have to cut to make a balance. So when those hit us, they hit us into the negative. So benefits have been doing well this year. Next year's a little bit of a different story. But as we look down through our expenditures, we've been doing okay. We've got a little bit of red in the fund transfers, which we've got debt service. That's like our special event center bonds, things like that. So not too terrible. So our expenditures are actually looking okay. And by the way, the benefits, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about this down the line, includes retiree trusts and our other post-employment benefits, so retiree health care and things like that. That's wrapped into that cost as well. So that's something to consider as we move forward, because I'll be talking about that a little bit. And then capital, I don't think I mentioned capital. The other red one was just capital purchases of like fire. It's not a huge line item, but. So the overall message for this fiscal year, like I said, revenues are recovering. I had a budget meeting not long ago where somebody said, well, Kate, how come we're looking at this was a while ago? How come we're looking at an $18 million hole? Things are getting better. They are getting better. The revenues are starting to recover. They haven't shot through the roof. We're not seeing a boom. But at the same time, I keep saying it, I know I said it last year, but we're not out of the woods yet. And this fiscal year, as we round out, kind of proves that. So one of the good pieces of this is that we are, you all know we went through the exercise of trying to head into a 2-year budgeting cycle. So not only are we looking at fiscal year 14, we're projecting forward another year and saying, okay, so 14 looks kind of rocky. How are we looking for 15? And so we're starting to look beyond the 1-year budgeting cycle, which I think is a big step for the city. We've not done that in the past. They've done it at the state level, largely centered around the fact that the legislature only meets every other year. But it's a very good practice to sort of project where you think you're going to be on revenues and expenditures. It allows you to be less surprised every year. So as we look forward, we think that's a pretty good step forward for us being a little bit more performance-based and strategy-oriented. And then we're also, as you saw, moving along the efforts with the new strategic plan. So the next budget, not the fiscal 14 that we're currently building, but the next budget will be largely aligned around the strategic planning process. So the idea being that the council sets the priorities, and then the budget is built as a resource to support those priorities. This year, again, we're doing kind of the transitional thing where we've got the same old performance measures for the most part that we've had. We've got the same old narrative and things like that that aren't running in complete concert with and tied in with the strategic planning process. We've got a new council and a lot of other things, but in 15, I think that'll all become very clairvoyant to us as far as how those things integrate. And I want to make it very aligned, so it's a little more organic in the way that it's presented together. So I think we'll all see that this year. We're kind of just hunkering down and doing what we can to get the document processed, but I think we're going to really take a hard look at a performance-based budget next year, as well as aligning that with the strategic planning process. So here's fiscal 14. This is what Andrew mentioned is the $7 million hole. It used to be a lot larger, but the long and short of it is that our expenditures are far outpacing any gains that we're seeing in our revenues. And so, you guys have heard about the shortfall. Here it is in numbers for those of you out there that like numbers. And then we'll dive a little bit into the details. So revenue, you can see a lot of red on this slide. Beginning fund balance, not a huge issue that we just budget for. The good news on property taxes are we were projecting almost a full percent, about a full percent decrease, and it's come in a lot less, well not a lot, but slightly less than we thought. It's almost flat, it's darn near flat. So that was a little bit of good news. It's not great, we're not positive yet, but we're thinking that we're heading up out of the hole at this point. We can kind of poke our heads above ground. C-tax, we're projecting very conservatively a 2.5% gain over this fiscal year. The state's projection was a little more rosy. I think we're still wanting to get a couple more months of numbers under our belt before we decide whether or not we're going to pop out. We're being very conservative in our revenue estimates. I'm hoping that that works to our favor so that at the end of the year, we're pleasantly surprised with some better revenue projections or revenue gains than we felt that we originally budgeted for. But at this point, things are still a little too shaky, or we don't have enough history under our belt for us to really be more aggressive in our revenue projections around C-tax. Let's see here. Charges for service, things like indirect cost reimbursements, alarm service charges, all those little charges that start to add up. That whole line item, and if anybody wants to see the detail behind this, I will gladly provide that for you. But it's kind of a big document. But all those little charges for service, when you add them all up, we're not quite there yet as far as our revenues are concerned. So I have challenged each of you in department budget meetings to take a look at the revenues that you're projecting, really take a hard look. Do you think they're going to improve? What are the factors around what you're collecting now? Or is something going to change? Or when you put in place a technological advance that might make it easier for us to collect revenues? Are we going to have a better collection rate because of X, Y, or Z? Whatever it is, we really need to do well individually at taking a look at how we run our business in each department and how we can take those revenues and apply them into the budget process. Because as we know, every little number counts at this point. So charges for service and fines and forfeitures and you know, indirect costing, all of those things kind of play into these numbers as we look down the projections for 14, and as you can see, some of the shortfalls. Franchise fees are going to recover. We've got some increases that are built in, but they're the last year of those increases. So this is the 14 will be the last year that you really see any bump in those things. Waste management contract, as we saw in the paper, gets us a little bit more in franchise fees, but you know, we can't really bank on all of those things because those things are in direct correlation with the economy as well. So we have to be a little bit better in our securing revenues and how we project and budget around them. And then lastly, the other and miscellaneous. Actually, we jump up to intergovernmental. That $3 million shows us not having the first SAFER grant that we secured, so we lose about $1 million there, or the equivalent of 10 positions. So that's where part of that $3 million number comes. So intergovernmental, there's the federal, state, local grants that we kind of see ebb and flow. We typically don't, I said this last year, we don't budget for those because until we have them, we can't really project them and put them into our budget. But on the expenditure side, we also take out the expenditures related to them, so you really are seeing a true picture. So revenue overview, we're seeing some ups and downs. The ups, like I mentioned, property tax. I mean, I'll give it an up, it's essentially flat, but it's not down. Not by much. Franchise fees and business licenses are picking up, so good job. I think we're seeing some more activity on the second floor, which makes me happy. And then C-tax. So I'm not going to tell you all to go out and start buying a lot of hard liquor and cigarettes, but I mean, if you felt like it, that probably would happen with our revenue situation. And then the downs, we've got the expiration of the first SAFER grant, which obviously is kind of the big elephant in the room. We've got another one of those. And then we've got some continued losses around some of our, you know, we've got like parking and traffic fines and things like that that continue to kind of fall short of what we need them to be. So all in all, about $2.1 million shortfall in our revenue projections, which you don't think sounds that bad, so how do we get to $7 million? Well, expenditures. So salaries and benefits are a big piece of what is driving us in that direction. We've got the agreements that have sunset provisions in them that we will see those sunsets expire at the end of this fiscal year. And I know there's discussions underway, but as the budget person, I can't really bank on whether or not those are going to be successful. So as it currently stands, the sunset provisions are in there. That's about, I think it's about $1.6 million. We saw some PERS increases, so our retirement increases. We've got healthcare costs increasing. All of those things add up when 85% of your expenditures are people, and these are all related to people, so those are some significant dollars. The reason you see stabilization up there in the middle used is, again, we're projecting, because you got to plug that hole, that we'll fully draw down stabilization in fiscal year 14. Hoping that's not the case, but we have to start off that way just because we have a shortfall. So the overview on expenditures is about a $4.7 million hole. So that plus the shortfall in revenues gets us to that $7.1 million. I talked about the contract to get back on the sunsets. We've got some automatic salary increases that kick in from July 1 per the contracts. And I mentioned the retirement and the insurance increases. So, I mean, we've got some challenges. It's not been an easy job. I should have known this before I took it. But I think that we can get there. And I think that we're going to be diligent and focused and work together to do a few things. The first being, like I said, replenishing those reserves. The key to that is that the next time, and we will, see an economic downturn, we're going to be able to weather it without being reactive and having to strip away services. It's going to flatten out that completely ebbing and flowing reactionary type situation that we're seeing. If I could have gone back 10 years and said, hey, you know, we really need to sock away a bunch, I mean, we do this at home too, right? Sock away a bunch of money for the chance that your roof fails, or you need to do X, Y, or Z. I mean, it's the same thing at the municipal level. And there are article after article saying that this is the best strategy to get there and to weather the next storm. So I know that everybody gets excited when things are doing well and we think, okay, you know, we can get back to the way that we were, salary increases and bigger staff, things like that. But I want to manage your expectations and let you know that the first priority of business in getting our fiscal house in order so that we can get back to some of those nice things that we used to enjoy is to make sure that we get those reserves built up and make sure that we are really responsible, which, you know, I mean, it's except for responsible, but it's really good to be responsible around budgeting. And we're going to do that. So we're going to put some policies in place so that when we do experience some upticks, we've got those mechanisms put into place. So I think we've got a very supportive council. I think we're going to see that during the budget process. So I don't anticipate us seeing a bunch of these sporadic or what I call sexy projects coming out of nowhere during the middle of the budget cycle. So I think that if we could all keep our eye on the prize, we conquer each goal one step at a time. First being replenishing our reserves, and we can move on and kind of get back to being a little bit more self-assured, I guess, in our budgeting process. So we are recovering. It's a slow recovery. We've got, like I mentioned, we've got expenditures that are far outpacing any gains that we're seeing in our revenues. So until we get out of that situation, we're just going to kind of ride this wave and do what we can. But right now in the process of the whole budgeting for fiscal year 14, I kind of think of us as being budget limbo because the departments have submitted to OMB your budgets and your asks for 14. In that process, we kind of line out and talk about revenues. We do everything we can to get a good landscape and take a deep breath and give a big sigh and say, gosh, we can't really do a lot as far as the asks. The good news is that we've got them. We know what you need. We couldn't agree more that you've taken a hard look and given us exactly what you think you need to do business. We're supportive of that. It's just that first priority of business is making sure that everybody gets paid. And so we have to balance this budget in order to do so. Not even touching on, but as the next priority order, especially after replenishing goals, we've got OPEB or retirement responsibilities that we haven't even really begun to scratch the surface of funding for those folks that have dedicated one of our service to the city. We want to make sure that we take care of them as promised when they first got their jobs, so that's the next step. And then of course, if you were there, we start to tackle the fact that also out there moving are these large unfunded capital improvements that we need to make and start setting aside money to do because, a failing Northwest pool roof or something like that is going to really come out of nowhere and set us back if we don't start setting aside money for those things that we know that we need to do. So we've got our challenges, that's for sure. But we're tackling them and we are stronger for it, I think. But what we are going to do is, right now in the process, we have prepared the information that you see. It's going to council and a workshop on the 24th of this month for them to say, we're going to say, here you go, giant pool. So what do you want to do? And they're, hopefully not going to say things like, well, we want to build a new, football arena across from City Hall or whatever, because obviously that's a little bit out of line with what we need to do. But we're going to give them that opportunity, just like we did with the departments, to sit down and say, okay, what is it that you need and how can we try to get there? And then that's that first preliminary workshop. And then we're going to do a process that's very similar to what we experienced last year, where we take the budget that you have all submitted, the Office of Management budget does, and we have given it kind of the scrub down or the once over. We then take it to executive team, management team, and kind of give it another set of eyes, look it over, and we go through a 3-step process. We do a department submitted, we do a manager recommended to the city council, and then we do a council adopted. It very closely mirrors what happens at the state level, which is where there's department requested, there's governor recommended, and there's legislative approved. So it's a very similar process. It's in alignment with what they do at the state, which we think is a good process. And of course, we've got the state budget director, former state budget director sitting right over here, so that's kind of a good reason to follow that process as well. So we're in that process right now. And like I said, budget limbo, because we can't really do much. I can't tell the departments, oh, you're going to get X, Y, or Z because things aren't looking that great. But council can make those decisions. And so we'll present to council the big formal workshop, sort of like we had last year, which we hope to have a very clean process. That'll be on the 6th of May. And then if we need a second one on the 13th of May. And then, of course, the budget adoptions per NRS would be on May 21st. Sorry. So that's the timing of the process as you see it. So like I said, we're kind of in a hunker and wait position right now. We're trying to queue up as much information for the city council to make some decisions as possible. But Andrew mentioned we've got some ideas on how to get there, and we will get there. It's just, it's not going to be easy for anybody, but it doesn't involve any layoffs on every report. So there's probably going to be questions. So I'd be happy to entertain them if you've got them. And I hate to be gloom, but I mean, it's, I wish I could be a little more rosy about the picture for next year, but you can see we've got some hurdles to overcome. Julie?
On your first slide, the sources and uses, what time period was that? Is that 13, 14? Is that an average over 5 years? What is the...
This I took out of last year, so this is just
12, 13 or 11, 12?
And I mean, they follow this very closely. For the last 3 or 4 years, we followed that very closely.
So it's basically an average?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other question, and you kind of touched on it, but last year the council got some funding to do what they wanted, and you said that you were going to meet with them to see what their interests are, and you probably have met with them. Do you think that they'll be getting some funding to do projects this year based on what
we don't have that built into the budget?
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how we could. In fact, we have a meeting this afternoon, our first meeting with the council, to give them an overview of the budget and where we're at. And given the negative $7.1 million, I don't know how we can possibly carve out anything for a Moana Springs or those sorts of things like we did last time. I just don't see it happening.
Okay. And do you anticipate that there will be any CIP money?
Yes,
or is it
and
too
we're
early
working
to
on
tell?
that. There's Miss Cindy over there shaking her head. I know a lot of you have had questions around that. We're working diligently to try to piece that together so that we can get a number for folks. But yes, there will be. I just don't know what that number will be. I don't know, Cindy. I know she's been gone the last 2 days, so I'm not going to put her on the spot and give her that information, but we can get back to the department heads with what we've got for projections for that this week.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
So one question that you might have is, okay, we've got $7.1 million shortfall, so how do we make that balance? And so Kate didn't really touch on that, but I just want to touch on that briefly with you. So a couple of things that we're looking at is currently in the health insurance program, we have some excess reserves. So make sure we have, what they call a fully funded IBNR, incurred but not reported claims, so enough to cover all your claims costs and your projected claims costs. And in addition to that, we have excess. So one of the things that we're looking at for next year is actually drawing down those excess reserves to help balance the $7.1 million shortfall that we're looking at. The other thing that we're looking at is a hiring freeze. So any vacant positions that are out there, we would freeze those positions. No layoffs, but freeze positions until we start to see things improve more than what we're projecting. The other piece that we're looking at is services and supplies. As Kate mentioned, we've asked all the departments to go back and look at services and supplies again and see if there are areas where we can make cutbacks. And I know you've done this probably 10 times at least in services and supplies, but that's one of the other components of this is going back and looking at those once again to see if there are things that we can live without. One of the other components of this is fleet purchases, for example. One of the ways to balance this, one of the ideas that's on the sheet is no fleet purchases. So essentially freezing that for a year as well. And so if we do all of those things, we can balance the $7.1 million shortfall without any layoffs. But as Kate mentioned, it still means holding the line, holding expenditures down, no fleet purchases, cutting back on services and supplies, and holding positions vacant. So it's not as bad as it's been in the past because we're not talking about layoffs, but it's not great either. But I do think we can make a balance without any additional layoffs. So I just wanted to give folks, I think, just a picture of how we can get from 7.1 in the deficit to a balanced budget. And this still doesn't get, we talked about the goal of the $8.3 million fund balance. This still doesn't get us there. This gives us an ending fund balance of $5.9 million, which is still 4%. So the budget that we're looking at still doesn't get to that goal of the 8.3% ending fund balance. That will have to come in future years as things begin to improve. So it's 7.1 short with a 4% ending fund balance and a $2 million contingency fund, which As you can see from this year, where we utilized all of that contingency fund, $2 million can go pretty fast in a contingency account. So just wanted to give you sort of a snapshot of where we're going with things. Yes?
And what Kate said is that this is with the assumption that the bargaining units are going to have it's a one-year plan, so those bargaining units are going to return to their original agreements.
Right, what this assumes is some of the contracts that were signed 2 years ago had concessions in them that are expiring. So this assumes those concessions that are expiring. So if we're able to reach agreement with the bargaining units on some of those concessions being extended for another year or two, that obviously helps with the bottom line as well. And then we could look at things like, okay, can we do some fleet purchases that maybe we have to do? Can we restore some of the services and supplies reductions? Can we release some of the frozen positions that we're looking at? So those would be some of the offsets if we were able to get some of those concessions extended for another year or two.
I think it's important to note that the things that Andrew talked about as far as our budget balancing options are one-time, options for us this year, like, dipping into the reserves. That's not going to be available in future years for us to do that. So we really have to, hunker down and kind of refocus the way that we do things, because we need to make changes so that we can continue into the future, stably. But I think it's important just to note that those things are one time. It's sort of a Band-Aid solution, I know, but we're also having council the option of making some hard choices for themselves. I think we're talking about, partial elimination of NAB funding or council contingencies and things like that, so that they can make those decisions for themselves too. And I think they're probably willing to go there. We'll see, but there's some, like I said, some tough calls that are on this list. And the fleet purchases, so far I think we're only recommending general funds, so I know that there's some special equipment in sewer streets and things like that. Those weren't included in the number. This is only general fund, as well as those frozen positions.
Is there anything at the legislature that may affect us either positive or negative?
Every day.
Yeah.
That's why we have cadence there.
Yeah. We've been asked.
Mostly for defense.
Right.
I mean, honestly, when we send Cadence and Megan down there, it's mostly for defense, to make sure that, they're down there to keep an eye out for legislation that could affect us negatively. We only have 2 bills that we're working on that we're trying to get passed. Most of their efforts are spent in a defensive position. Now, there was a redo of the C-tax formula, but that's, in the long term, that's actually going to have a positive impact on us. The way that the C-tax funds are distributed to local government, that formula was revised by the legislature, but that should be a positive for us in the long term. But there's always stuff that comes up that potentially could be a negative for us. I don't have anything specific to give you off the top of my head, but.
Well, anytime they think the bill might have an impact on the local government, they send us a request for a fiscal note, which means we have to read the legislation and write whether or not we think it'll have it. We've done 96 of them so far. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that could potentially touch us. But.
Any other questions? Comments? It's not that bad. It has been much worse, so it's not that bad. It's actually, as Kate said, if you look at the property tax, it's essentially flat this year. I anticipate that in fiscal year 15, we'll start to see that grow slightly. It's not going to be huge growth, but at least it'll be positive. C-tax hopefully will continue to grow as well. So fiscal 14, in my opinion, is sort of going to be the bottom of where we're at, and then we're going to slowly start to grow out of that. And as we start to grow out of that, we have to, as Kate said, we have to begin to address those long-term issues to make sure that as we move forward in the future, that we're positioned better to handle the next downturn, because it will come again. These things happen in cycles, so we have to build up those reserves. We have to begin to pre-fund the liabilities that we have out there, and then in the end, we'll be better for it. Any other questions?
Do you guys have any questions? I
I have a question about the NAB. You brought up the NABs. Have you brought that up to the council yet at all?
We've had some discussions with them about it. In fact, some of them have suggested it. And I didn't mention that that $7.1 million that we're talking about, that's one of the items that's on the list is reducing or eliminating the NAB funding. And they have talked about that as well. I've had them talk about what if we took some of the NAB money and put it to graffiti abatement and funded some of that, because that's obviously been a hot topic lately in the community. So we've talked about it a little bit, but we're really just beginning to have those discussions with council on the budget and sort of where we're at. I mean, obviously they've heard, they know that we have a shortfall. We just haven't gone through any of the detail with them yet.
The other item is, they have their discretionary funds, and I see this on the council agendas all the time, and I know that these groups come in and say, just give us 3,000 here and 5,000 there, and it may not seem like a lot of money, but there's money going to the school district and to the, to build a playground, or 5,000 here to help, sell cookies or whatever it is, and to me, when we're in a case like this, $15,000, $20,000, $80,000 of discretionary money, we should start funneling that money back to our core services.
And that is on the list as well.
Yeah.
So
We have 70,000 there.
right.
And building a playground, I'm just using that as an example because it was on the agenda for a school, to me, is not a core service of the city.
Right. No, those are on the list as well. So the list to balance the 7.1 million includes council contingency funds. I think in total it's 100,000 plus the 70, so it's actually $170,000 of those funds has been, at least on our preliminary list that we're going to go over with council, has been marked as a way to balance that 7.1. So I agree with you. I agree with you.
The good news too, though, is that we've got some folks working on some pretty progressive revenue potential earners, and none of that's been included in this. So we've got, I know the police department's looking at an innovative program that they're working on. Fire department's looking at some revenue collection options and some improvements in service around inspections and things like that. Those aren't included in here because we can't wrap those things into the budget until we actually have that program up and running and have some estimates underway. So, that's kind of a silver lining. There's that unknown. So in 6 months from now, we could have a very different situation if a lot of that stuff is up and it's been proven to be successful in other jurisdictions. We've got an amnesty program that Cassie, I know you're looking at with the courts, things like that. That people are being very creative and innovative around the ways to improve their revenue collection or further decrease expenditures, because it's not just about cutting. It's also revisiting the way that we do business. So kudos to those folks that are also looking at those efforts, because hopefully those turn out to be really positive for us.
Any other questions on the budget? Comments? Ideas? Anybody have ideas on $7.1 million?
I'm pretty sure we looked under every rock. Thank you, Gayla.
We did, literally.
Gayla knows
under
about
every
rocks
rock.
none of us knew we had, so she's been great that way. But yeah, if you've got suggestions or ideas, obviously you have my email address. You can shoot any one of us, at OMB. I mean, heck, Andrew's open to it. Whatever you've got, we're open to helping long-term solutions for us, and we'll get there.
Okay. Any other